Hi there, I'm Teresa and I am here today to introduce our newest pattern called Voyage. Yay! So when you purchase your pattern you will receive your instructions which include instructions for hand piecing, for machine piecing and also for English paper piecing. Now today I am going to focus on the English paper piecing side for you. And I'm going to be using the template that is included with your pattern. So that's really great, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about why I always include an acrylic template for your pieces. And I am going to be using EPP 2-inch squares. For those of you who haven't used EPP before, they are a wonderful Australian product. They are made from heat-proof mylar, so they can be reused over and over again. They can be ironed, they can be glue basted. You can spray starch and press your seam allowances in place to prepare for later, and that's pretty exciting projects that we've got coming up using that process. But today we are going to stick with basic English paper piecing using these squares. So it's a great project for people who are just starting out, who are wanting something nice and simple. But for those of you that scrap basket is a little bit overflowing, and that would be me. So what I have got is I have got our supplies ready to go and show you, and we'll get started. You can see a little glimpse of our pattern sample. Forgot what I was going to say. Our sample in the background there, made from some gorgeous Liberty prints and also some last little bits I had left of some of my favourite Tilda fabrics. So I'm ready to quilt that. Again, with this project, the good thing is that you can make it as small or as large as you want to. So this is just going to be a sample size, so I'm going to keep it just a moderate size so it's easy to carry around and not too big. But of course, if you chose to, you could just keep on working around the outside edge and you could make it into a king size. That would definitely make a dent in your scrap bucket. So let's have a look at our supplies. Change cameras. We go. Okay, so of course, first thing we need our pattern and our template. We need some EPP 2-inch squares. Most importantly, we need some fabrics. So these fabrics that I have collected and popped here are sort of all odds and ends that I had in pretty florals that were left over from another project. So I have really odd amounts of all of them. So some of them I have large amounts, others I only had little offcuts of them. So they are perfect for this project. So let's have a look at what else we need. So these are, it wouldn't be a video at home if you didn't have a dog barking in the background, would it? So we have our EPP templates. We're going to work with those in a moment. We have our, I prefer to glue based. So we have our glue pen. You certainly can still thread based with the EPP templates, but you need to just thread based through your fabric. It's impossible to thread based through the templates, but you stick to whatever method works for you best. We have some marking pens. Now, I have been using these pens, which are friction pens. Word of warning, I am completely against using them on the front of your quilt and for marking quilting designs. I only use them on the back of my fabric, so for marking template lines and cutting lines. They do leave a residue in your fabric, and I'm okay with that because I want my quilts to be used, and they are going to suffer a lot more damage than simply a little bit of residue left from the pen. They are likely to be washed quite regularly. If you're contemplating making an heirloom style quilt that you want to last for a long time, really think about your choices for your marking tools. I probably would just simply use a soft lead pencil or chalk pencil or something similar to that. I live in Queensland, so our humidity and our UV is going to do a lot more damage to my quilts. That it is really not the type of place that you want to live to produce heirloom quilts. So I want my quilts to be used, so I make functional quilts. So we've got our marking pens, we've got our sew line, I've got some scissors. I do have a rotary cutter and a little tiny mat here. I've got my hand sewing needles, so I like to use a straw or a milliner's needle, they're the same thing, about a size 10 or a size 11. I find the size 11s I bend quite easily, but the 10s and 11s are great to use. Then thread choices. We are so lucky that we have lots and lots of thread choices. I have a couple of preferences. I basically only work with mostly neutral colours. So in my thread choices, I have a cream, a white, a dark colour like a charcoal grey, and then I have lots of pretty kind of colours. So I sort of have a dark champagne kind of colour or maybe a pastel pink that I use. But I don't use a huge, it's not necessary to match your thread to your fabric every single time. So my favourite choices for threads are very fine threads. So I like bottom line thread, which is a 100 weight, it's actually a 60 weight polyester. So it's very fine. Wonderfill Invisifil is a 100 weight thread. Again, it's a very, very fine thread and it's wonderful to stitch with. And the other one that I really like is called Daco Bob. It's also from Wonderfill and it's an 80 weight thread. It's just got a little bit more of a sheen to it and it's beautiful to stitch with. So they're my preferences, but try a few different threads and see which one works for you. I find that the finer the thread hides my stitches a lot better. I do use a double strand of thread, and the reason that I do that is I'm very prone to losing needles. So it's not for strength and it's not for any other reason apart from the fact that if I stop working partway through and my needle and my thread is still attached, I'm less likely to lose the needle. So that's just what works for me. You pick your own way of doing it, but that's my personal preference, is to just have it so that my needle, and I've got it here, if I just, here's one I've started, so what I've got is my needle and 2 strands of thread and my needle will not fall off, and that works for me. And so for me, that's correct. Try what works for you and see how you go. All right, so let's get started. Let's move our little supplies out of the way. Little bits that I have prepared. Okay, so I have started and prepared a few little squares there, as you can see. Now my next round that I need actually requires 8 squares. So this little piece of fabric is obviously, it's had really random shapes cut out of it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just lay my template on the top. And that's not a selvage, that's a cut edge. I'm going to use the green pen and I'm going to just simply trace around my template. Now grain is not 100% as important when you're English paper piecing, because what we're actually looking for is the shape, and because all of our seams are supported before we start stitching, we won't get any stretching. So I've just traced around and I can trace another one. And of course our template has got our seam allowance built in. so we don't need to worry too much about where we go. And you can see those. Now there are two ways we can cut these out, of course. So I am going to just use scissors. Now the template is made with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I like just a little tiny bit more. So I'm going to cut just outside of my drawn line. And I've got a fold line here in my fabric, but that's fine. We don't need to worry too much about that. We don't need to press our fabric too well. We just need to get out any really major creases. So this is just a little gentle fold line that will come out when we press. I'll cut my second one out. I prefer to use a smaller or mid-sized pair of scissors, but I know some of you like big dressmaking shears, so go right ahead. Use what works for you. Okay, so that's cutting with scissors and our template. If you are the type of person who loves to use a rotary cutter, what you can actually do is just simply lay your template on, cut with the rotary cutter, and I'm going to use 2 hands to cut this so that I can't, normally I would spin my mat around. Going to cut the other 2 sides. Okay. And that's our 3rd one cut out. So that's 3 pieces cut out really, really quickly. So next step is to prepare our pieces. So glue basting. I'm going to pop this down. Going to pop just 2 little tiny swipes of glue, hardly even noticeable in the center there. Pop it down, pop my template in place, roughly centering it. And I am going to, not going to put a full swipe of glue all the way over. All I'm going to do is just 3 or 4 little dots of glue on the side, and then just gently fold it over. Just 3 or 4 little tiny swirls. And with our glue, with our seam allowance, we don't need to pull it really tight up against our fabric. We just need it to hold in place. Okay, 3 and 4. So that's our 4 sides. Now, if I find that I have a little corner or something that's lifting up, what I can do is just a tiny little swipe under there, and that's prepared, ready to go. So I didn't fussy cut or look at my pattern repeat or anything like that for these shapes. What I did was I just worked from the wrong side and cut them out, and that's my choice. If you are wanting to fussy cut, that's another video for another day. We can talk about that, but with the Mylar see-through templates, it's extremely simple. Let's pop that down, and we shall do this one is the one that's rotary cut, so you can see that my seam allowance is just a tiny little bit shorter. I do prefer to just have a smidge more seam allowance than a 1/4 inch, but it really is only a personal preference. Okay. And I usually don't manage to get my template centered perfectly, which is why I prefer to have a tiny little bit more than a 1/4 inch, because it allows for my misshapen spacing. So that's our pieces glued. Next step, our stitching. So I have started here. My blue is my center, and we're going to be working in rounds. So anybody that is familiar with crocheting would be familiar with the term that's rounds. So we have our center, we have one piece, one square on all four sides of our center. So what we're going to do then is we're going to stitch those on in one continuous row of stitching. So I am about halfway across our first piece. Going to just continue stitching that. Now I have, you'll notice, like I said, I have a double thread. When I line my pieces up, you'll find that my pieces line up perfectly and beautifully because our mylar templates are so accurate. If you feel comfortable, you can pop a little wonder clip on here. Now I'm left-handed, so I'm going to be stitching from left to right. So I do stitch what most of you will say is back to front, but that's okay. I'm used to being looking at things a little differently and the opposite. So I'm going to stitch left to right. Now, for those of you that are right-handed, so I'm stitching mirror image to a right-hander. So I stitch, my natural movement is to stitch towards me. But for a right-handed person, and I am not going to try and stitch right-handed, for a right-handed person, your natural movement to stitch towards you actually puts quite a lot of stress on your wrist. So I can't stitch right-handed, I cannot. But you need to teach yourself and have a look at some of the other people who do the English paper piecing. Your best bet is to stitch away from you because that is your natural movement, is away. But for me, as a lefty, flip this over, is to stitch towards me. I choose to whip stitch because that's what works for me. There are no rights or wrongs. There are no quilt police. Try a few different methods and see what works for you. There are ladies who love the flat back method and gentlemen who love to stitch with the flat back method. I'm happy with the whip stitch. I've tried the flat back. It just doesn't work for me. There are also quite a number of people who love to use the ladder stitch. And that's great too because it's all about getting the result that you're happy with. A very, very fine thread will help hide your threads. And also you'll find once you remove your templates, your fabric will relax a little bit and your stitches won't become really obvious. I don't mind a few stitches being seen. I'm happy for people to see that I have handmade their quilt for them. So a few hand stitches in there, it's just a little bit of a token to show that it's been made by hand, not by a factory. So I'm almost to the end of this row and people ask about, well, this tail's in the road. How do I manage that? So what I do is I just simply roll that out of the way, keeping my corner where it needs to be, and stitch right up to my corner. It's very hard to see, isn't it? Okay. And particularly when you're stitching with a neutral coloured thread, it blends, which is great because no one can see our stitches. And a final little stitch in the corner. And then just in case I stitch pieces wrong, I like to do a knot at every corner. So the knot that I do is I was taught how to do this knot by a lady who does embroidery. And I believe it's a derivation of a colonial knot, but don't quote me on that. There may be other names for it as well. So pop your needle halfway through and the thread at the front goes around the needle in one direction, and the thread from the eye of your needle goes in the opposite direction, and then you just pull it through, and you've got a really tight, secure little knot. And I have stitched all the way across, and if I open that up, you can see perfect stitching, a little blurry. It's nice bright sunshine here today, so there we go. So that's our first piece stitched in place, and if I pop that back, what we need to do then is we can continue to stitch. So we don't need to break our thread. Here's our thread here. What we'll do then is we will just continue to stitch with our second piece, and we will stitch along this edge. So of course, if you're right-handed, you are going to be stitching from right to left, and this will be your second piece, third, fourth. But I'm going to be working clockwise, and you're going to be working anti-clockwise. So that's our first round completed. So after that, what we're going to do then, our second round, so this is round one, round two will have 8 pieces of 8 squares. So 4 for the first one, and then each round increases by 4. So we're going to pop these on here, just as a starting point. But we would continue around with our prepared squares, so that we had 8 of them. And then we would just continue. So again, the next row of stitching will be done in a continuous row. So you will come back to this point, and you can actually just continue stitching all the way around in one continuous row of stitching. The next row will have 12 squares, and again, it's a continuous row of stitching all the way around. So it's nice and simple. It's a great project for beginners. You will have very close to perfect points, and it might make a little dent in your scrap bucket. So, okay, there we go. So that's our prepared and ready to go. Now, a lot of people actually ask me why I include the template. I've got a lovely little bench space here that I'm working on, but you'll notice that my working area is only a little corner. I don't need a huge big area. This cutting mat that I'm using for a demo is actually the size of an A4 piece of paper. So when I'm working with this, I don't need a huge area. You can certainly cut by size if you're lucky enough to have the space to work, but we don't all have the space to work. And what I find with my English paper piecing and a template included, and I picked up this little container from Kmart, is that it's just a little container. I can pop my cutting board in, my scissors, my template, my glue stick, rotary cutter, pattern, templates, needles, thread, fabric, pop the lid on, and everything that I have and need is all contained in a little box that can be tucked away, popped on a shelf, will fit in a filing cabinet. It will fit on a bookcase. It's a really nice, simple little project. You certainly can work with a rotary cutter if that's what you choose, but this is just a nice, simple, portable project that you can take with you. Or also, it's just perfect for those that don't have a big designated sewing area. So you can even use the lid as your preparation area. Now, the other thing that I get asked very frequently is, how do I remove my templates? Now, I'm giving you a little sneak peek at our next pattern, and it's called Abundance, and it is made up of beautiful squares and gorgeous floral fabrics. But people are very concerned about how they removed glued templates. Now, they are super simple to do. Because I'm sparing with the glue, they're not difficult to remove. So I'm going to take out this white one here. So if I just use my fingernail and I just pick my fabric up, because it's only in a couple of spots, it's really, really simple to remove. When you're stitching with the EpiFlex templates, because they're mylar, there is no risk of you stitching through the template. It is almost impossible. You will put your finger through the needle through your finger before you can put it through the mylar template. So it's just simple. Peel it off. My template, which is gluey, can be, you can pop them in a laundry bag and give them a rinse, but what I do is I actually just put a little bit of washing up liquid on my hands, give them a bit of a rub and dry them on a tea towel, and they're ready to go. In fact, I will use them a couple of times with glue on them before I even give them a rinse. So you can see that my seam allowances are sitting really well because I haven't disturbed them a great deal. If I'm concerned about how my seam allowance are sitting and I want to check that my quilt is sitting nice and flat as I'm progressing, I will sometimes give them a little spray starch, and I love the Heaven Scent spray starch. Again, another Australian product. Yay! It's all natural in Australian scents. I give it a little spray starch, let the starch soak in, and give it a press. I don't need to worry about the starch going on my other templates because they are mylar, and also when I iron them, I can iron the whole thing. So the mylar is heat proof and I can reuse my templates and I'm ready to go. So I can remove them as I go, and of course it makes it much more flexible and easy to work with. And I don't need as many templates because I have that area to work in. So, thank you for joining me today. I hope that you will enjoy working on your very own Voyage quilt and that it makes a little bit of a dent in your scrap bucket. Make sure you send us some photos, and happy stitching. Bye.